For building applications, you can choose between a variety of frameworks and technologies, like there's Flutter, React Native, Ionic, Swift, Kotlin. But what makes Flutter so different? Flutter is a framework for cross-platform app development. That means you can run your app on multiple platforms with the same code base. And that's the key difference to Swift and Kotlin, which are programming languages for native app development. So Kotlin is for Android and Swift for iOS. And in past days, where there were no such frameworks for cross-platform development, you had to write your whole app again for different platforms like Android or iOS. Kinda tedious, right? Usually you have two teams, one for Android and one for iOS, and they have to align each other. And now with cross-platform frameworks like Flutter, you can just use the same code and run it on both platforms. Although there are some limitations, which I'm gonna address later. So with these frameworks, you save yourself a lot of time and money, which you might rather want to use on improving your app, or just more free time. But just to be fair, these native programming languages are still used mainly for performance, or just to have the latest platform-specific changes. Over time, these advantages shrink, so that in most cases you're better off using a cross-platform framework. Ionic ships with a set of UI elements based on web technologies. To render these components, it makes use of a web view, which is like a stripped-down web browser in full screen. This is often referred to as a hybrid app. It also provides access to native hardware via a hardware API. So you have an UI completely based off web technologies and will have a consistent design across the platforms. You can just gather a team of web developers, and although they need to learn the components of Ionic, they already have the knowledge in CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. The advantage here is clearly the known technologies and a high degree of code sharing. On the other hand, Ionic apps might not look and feel as great as native apps. The UI might look much different to that of the native UI components of the platform, so it might not look and fit into the platform's design. Also, the performance is much lower, so in some cases, scrolling or animations are not as smooth. React Native also uses JavaScript, but in a different way. It uses a module named JavaScript interface that allows to access the native API via the JavaScript to create real native components. Here you have the benefit of creating apps that feel more like native by having platform-specific UI elements. With the new JavaScript interface, the performance loss from the old bridge has improved a lot, so it also competes with Flutter in that category. Code sharing is a bit less than in Ionic, because of the dependency to the native UI, so sometimes you have to use specific code for a platform. Flutter is the newest framework of these three. It uses a render engine called Skia to draw widgets, and it uses the programming language Dart. On top of it, there is a Flutter framework that ships a set of UI components. The key benefit is that the app runs as native code, and thus you have a higher performance than in Ionic. The widgets of Flutter just look like native elements, but they are rendered in Skia. The hot reload works great for Android apps, although on Flutter for web I sometimes had issues with it. There are also diagnostic tools for installing missing dependencies and code migration tools. To me, the tooling and the developing experience with Flutter was better than with other frameworks. The downside, however, is that you need to learn the programming language Dart, which shouldn't be that big of a deal in my opinion. Also, the code sharing is not as good as in Ionic. You sometimes need to use different widgets for each platform, but there are more and more widgets that work platform independent. And also the look and feel needs to be adapted unless you want to have your app look like an Android app on iOS or on the web browser. So to conclude, Ionic is the best if you want to use web technologies and have a high amount of code sharing. If you come from React or just want to have a native look and feel, React Native might be your choice. The performance is close to native because it creates native elements using the JavaScript interface. Flutter also has good performance because of its own render engine Skia. And if you want to have a native look and feel without being dependent to the native UI framework, Flutter is your choice. There are probably much more reasons and personal preference to choose either of these frameworks. So leave your comment below, what is your favorite and why?